Sometimes in Bible study and interpretation, there's a tendency to hyper focus on little nuances and subtleties, whether real or perceived, of grammar and definitions. I want to illustrate one that came up in the 1800s. A man named Granville Sharp came up with a rule for interpreting Greek grammar. Now I'm going to illustrate the situation in English. Suppose I say, the president and CEO will be here today. Are the president and CEO the same person or two different people? If I say the president and CEO will be here, and it's not known if they're the same, it'll generally be assumed that they are the same person, the president and CEO. But if I say the president and the CEO will be here today, we generally will assume that that's two different people. It's that second the. Say the president and the CEO versus the president and CEO. That's how it tends to play out in English. There's no grammar rule for that per se. It's just a common way of speaking for clarity. Now, let's suppose I say the president and first lady will be here today. Well, everybody knows the president and first lady are two different people. So there was no need to say the president and the first lady will be here. You could if you wanted to, but everyone knows that the president and first lady are two different people. So a very similar situation occurs in the Greek language, and I'm not going to try to explain any of the nuances here. You can look up Granville Sharp's rule on that, and I put the word rule in quotation marks because I don't think it's really a rule. He's a guy writing in the 1800s who was commenting on patterns he saw in Greek. He didn't go back to Greek and cite some Greek grammarian saying, here's our grammatical rule for this. This is just a way of speaking to make things clear where they might otherwise be ambiguous. And his rule comes into play in a number of verses that speak of God and Savior. You might remember back to my video on Is Jesus God, where I said I don't say Jesus is God and I don't say Jesus is not God because the Bible doesn't say either of those, so I don't say either one. But Sharp's rule was constructed primarily for the purpose of stating position on that. They were trying to equate God and Jesus in a number of places. One key instance of this is in Titus 2:13. A literal translation of the Greek says something like, the great God and Savior of us, Jesus Christ. Now in English, we wouldn't tend to say the Savior of us, we would say our Savior. But in Greek, it's Savior of us, not our Savior. The King James, which was translated before Sharp's rule was invented, says, the great God and our Savior, Jesus Christ. Whereas the modern translations take the of us, the our, put that back over with God and say our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. And so because they believe Granville Sharp's rule proves that God and Savior, Jesus Christ, are the same, quote, person, that in their minds justifies taking the our, the of us, that's tied to Savior and moving it back over in front of God, because if they're the same person, then the our can apply to both. So they're taking an ambiguity in the language and trying to force a specific understanding of it into English. But as with president and CEO or president and first lady, it still all goes back to whether the writer deemed it ambiguous to not include the definite article the with Jesus Christ if he was treating them God and Jesus as two separate, quote, persons. Certainly if Jesus is God was part of his doctrine, he would have taught that clearly. Even if he didn't mention it in this letter, he would have taught that clearly. So it would have been unambiguously true that God and Savior were meant to be one person, not two. On the other hand, if he didn't teach them that, he would have had to have deemed it so obvious that they were two persons that he didn't need to put in the second article. So the bottom line on Titus 2:13 is that the wording is consistent with either one person or two persons, depending on what Paul thought his audience already knew. Whereas the way people use Sharp's rule is to say that Paul is teaching the statement Jesus is God by this verse, which there's a lot plainer ways to say Jesus is God than to use some subtle rule of Greek grammar that wouldn't be discovered for 1800 years. So again, I am not here claiming Jesus is God. I am not here claiming Jesus is not God. I'm trying to stick with what the Bible actually says and not read my own opinions into it. Now, 2 Peter 1:1 is similar, but it actually does have the word our or of us tied to God. It's the great God of us and Savior Jesus Christ. So the modern translators are perfectly justified in putting our in front of God rather than in front of Jesus Christ in 2 Peter 1:1. Let's illustrate this one in English. Since God is not given a name in these verses, and Savior is given a name, Jesus Christ, in these verses, let's use the President and First Lady similarly. And we'll use the 2 Peter 1:1 construction. Our great President and First Lady Jill Biden. Everybody still knows that the President and Jill Biden are two different people. If we didn't know that, we would tend to assume, from the linguistics of it, we would tend to assume that the great President and First Lady Jill Biden were the same person. Let's say long future from today, where female presidents are very common, we wouldn't necessarily know that First Lady means wife of the president. First Lady could very well be a title ascribed to a female president. So it would be linguistically ambiguous whether our great President and First Lady Jill Biden was one person or two, linguistically. But since we all already know they're two different people, that ambiguity is taken away. But years down the road, it could become ambiguous, and then people could invent a Sharp's type rule to say, they must be the same person. But that would be, at least in that case, would be incorrect. So with both Titus 2:13 and 2 Peter 1:1, we have linguistical ambiguity. And the correct interpretation is based on what the author believed the audience already knew. So if the author already knew that the audience believed God and Jesus were the same, then the words would be perfectly consistent with that. On the other hand, if the author believed everyone already knew God and Jesus were two different, quote, persons, then the ambiguity vanishes.